Hmm. Hello, everyone. Joe here again in Barichara, calling in today to host a discussion about cultural scaffolding and bioregional design. I am really looking forward to this one because I've actually never tried to teach this topic before. And so I had fun creating new slides and asking, how do you teach this stuff? I mean, I know a lot about it. How do I teach? So anyway, it is just to say, I was having fun preparing the presentation for all of you. And I hope you have fun seeing the materials and then us all discussing it. I'm just really looking forward to this. And I see everyone is saying hello there in the chat box, which is lovely to see you all here. Welcome back, all of our familiar friends. And today we are on week 4, which means that at the end of this week, we'll be at the halfway point of this learning journey. And that's going to open up a really interesting question for us. How do we want this learning journey to evolve, and what do we want it to become by the time that 2-month period is over? And so we can start asking ourselves these scaffolding questions for the learning journey too. Today, what I want to do just for fun to get us started is I created a little poll, and I'm going to make it visible now. I'd love for you to answer this poll. What are you most excited to learn about today? Is it more about pro-social? Is it about bioregional design? Do you want to learn about cultural scaffolding? Or you're like, I just can't choose. Can I have all of them? I'm just curious what you guys are going to say. Yeah, you can see I playfully stacked the deck for the final option. So yeah, I'm glad to see that we are in general agreement that bioregional design is super important, and that we really need to learn about all of these things, and more importantly, how they fit together, and that cultural scaffolding is just so important, and we need to see examples of it. And today we're going to look at real life bioregional design, what we're doing here in Barichara, and we'll explore it as a type of cultural scaffolding. And I see George is saying, buenos dias de la selva de Peru. Bienvenidos, George. Es bueno que estás acá. Vamos a juntar y aprender mucho. I'm just saying, I'm excited to learn together with George. I want to come and visit him in Peru. Come on, that sounds awesome. So, what I am really excited about today is that I'm going to attempt to create a conversational container for us to talk about some really complex things and do it in really concrete and actionable ways. So that means I'm setting myself up. You could say, like, as the teacher, the one who's teaching today, I'm setting myself up to fail. I'm trying to accomplish something that's really hard. And so, that means for me, it's like exciting. It's going to be fun to see if we can get to where we're trying to go. So, normal housekeeping, please have lots of conversations in the chat bar during the presentation and afterwards, because so much knowledge and learning can happen there. And of course, we got the ask a question button for posing questions about the webinar, and that we'll be able to have dialogue afterwards. And since we're trying to keep ourselves to about an hour today, I would really like to just jump in and get started. So let's go ahead and get ourselves going. And what I think is really beautiful about today's webinar is that we're going to try and weave really local actions with really big picture needs or challenges. And so we're talking about scaffolding for bioregional design. I think a lot of you have seen this image before, but for those of you that haven't, this is actually a drone photograph taken from a video that my friend Stefan produced. So this is a drone flying over part of Barichara, Colombia. And Barichara is off to the right, just to the right of where it says Bioparque, on the right side of the image. And what we're mapping here is a set of reforestation projects that already exist, together with Las Albercas, which is a project we'd like to raise the money and buy and turn into a reforestation project. And when I created this graphic, it was to explain that we're actually mapping out part of a tributary where we could try to bring a river back to life. And the reason I wanted to show this image is that as we look at projects that exist in a territory, we can actually map them onto satellite images or aerial photography to see how the connectivity of the land shows us how the humans should cooperate in the projects on the ground. So here's an example where there's this Guaymaro project, which is two of our friends from Holland who have been doing reforestation work for 10 years, and their neighbor Manuela has 8 hectares of land right next to them. And so they're already collaborating, but are they collaborating with the Bioparque where we're working, or the Origen del Agua, which is the new forest reserve that we bought with crowdfunding money and are starting to do work on? Right now, these are like isolated projects, but narrative-wise, story-wise, we can start to connect them. And we want to explore how we can create this kind of scaffolding to take projects that already exist and create new projects that integrate them, and then create new projects from them to expand across a territory. So another way to say this is we started off the learning journey with a big picture agenda, which is to regenerate the entire planet. But the entire planet is sort of too big, and we don't really know how to think about the entire planet very well. But if we zoom in to continents and land masses and look at things like mountain ranges and river systems, then we can start to see local territories or this bioregional scale where we could try to create local living economies. But how do we do that? Turns out to do that, we have to go zoom into each one of those bioregions and ask ourselves, what are the commons that exist? Or if they don't, how do we create them so that pro-social groups, small teams of people, can build their psychological capacities for cooperation and creative interaction with their environments, and strong trust and generosity amongst them to be able to navigate difficult challenges and do really hard things together. And so what we want to do today is sort of go from the big picture down. How do we do planetary regeneration? Well, we create bioregional capacities. How do we do that? We create local groups that can manage regenerative development for their bioregions. But also we can go in the other direction. If we're good at creating pro-social groups, then we can create them for a bioregional design project, and then we can create them for networks of bioregional design projects, and that's how we move up to the planetary scale. So what we're talking about today applies equally in both directions. This is a diagram that sort of is just meant to give us a visual image, sort of a shared understanding of what we're going to talk about today. Is if we imagine that there's just a bunch of people living in your community, each of these X's represents a person in your community who cares about regeneration. That might be they want to restore the water and soils. They could be a gardener. They could be someone that does nature conservation. It doesn't matter. They're doing something, or they're interested or care about something that could regenerate the land. But the thing is, right now, there's just a bunch of isolated individual people. So what we need to do is do social weaving and create tapestries. And the way we do that is by organizing these people into pro-social groups. And I drew this schematically to say these groups can be separate, be their own group, or sometimes you can have members of one group that are also part of another, or you can have the mission and the purpose of each group overlap, so they might form an alliance to make an even bigger group. That's a cluster of them. But the important thing here is just conceptually to say the work of bioregional design is about organizing the regenerative leaders of a territory into functioning teams with coherent ways that those teams can become integrated. And they can become integrated into their own territory. Now we're going to make sense of that for the rest of the webinar. And I want to do that by being very concrete and showing you what we're doing here in Barichara. And then from this concrete example, pull out of it what conceptually or what strategically anyone could do anywhere. So one thing that we did when my family first arrived here in November of 2019, so it's been a little bit less than 2 years, is we started creating a map, and I just mean a mental map, or we would look at Google Earth or Google Maps, and we'd say, oh, we visited this project here, we visited that project there, and we'd start to see where they were in the landscape. And as we started to discover that there's this reforestation effort in the Bioparque, which is a community park. There's a project over here where they're recharging the aquifers. There's an Escuela Bosque, which is a forest school for children, where they're teaching children eco-literacy and nature connection. There's this cool community garden project that started during the pandemic. There are various projects on private land and so on. So what we started to see was in the territory, we could create a map of projects. But notice the projects are not connected to each other in any meaningful way. It's not clear if the people even know each other from one project to another, or if they're collaborating. So this first step is just to say, what are the existing projects in my territory, and where are they in the territory? Then the next thing we do is we start to say, well, how does this territory work? And because I studied atmospheric science when I was in graduate school, and specifically I studied how clouds form, I happened to be able to notice some really important patterns, which is I started looking at there are 3 mountain ranges that form roughly a triangle. And inside those 3 mountain ranges is this degraded and deforested plateau you can see in the upper left. And this deforested plateau, I estimated about 50,000 hectares of land was deforested, but the entire area inside the triangle is about 500,000 hectares of land. And I'm trying to account here for the larger geologic structures, the larger weather systems and hydrological patterns to say all of these local projects are embedded within a very large, dynamic, territorial process of geology, ecology, meteorology, and how do they relate to each other. And all of this was preparing me to build scaffolding for pro-social groups. Because then what I could do is say, well, what would be needed as a whole system intervention? And what I started to notice was this plateau, 50,000 hectares of deforestation. This is all hard-packed clay that's hot and dry like cement. And if I start watching the weather patterns, as I did for an entire year, I noticed that this hot, dry air, because the sun, we're right at the equator, the sun hits this and bakes the ground, the hot, dry air rises up, and then the moist air can't get in. Meaning if I stand in the middle of this plateau and look around, I will see rain clouds in every direction, but it cannot enter the plateau because the weather system is being blocked by the deforested land surface, which means the design challenge is to intentionally change the regional climate, to reverse the process of making a desert, to bring surface forest back onto this land so that the hot, dry air is weaker and the rain clouds can more easily enter, which is how we bring the rain using the forest. And see, this is all based on geologic and meteorological or climatological information while looking at the land surface and the deforestation patterns. And all of this is to say, okay, I've mapped all of these projects, I've embedded them in a knowledge of the larger system, and what is the scale of intervention that's needed. And it turns out the scale is the entire 500,000 hectare area, focusing on about 50,000 hectares of deforested land with connections spreading outward from there. So this is a pretty big project. So how do we do cultural scaffolding when that's our project? And how can we spread the social behaviors of regenerative practice so that we actually get this project off the ground? Well, that's what I want to talk about now. So you may have all seen the homework activities this week. If you haven't, you can go back and check them out later. But I introduced the concept of cultural transmission, which is basically that ideas, behaviors, practices, institutions, that they spread from person to person across a social network. And what I've done here is created a conceptual image. Here's a stick figure of a person standing next to a tree, which is just meant to say, this is someone who cares about reforestation. So this is someone who might plant a tree or protect a tree. And what we want to know is if there's a person who wants to reforest, how can regenerative practices spread from that person to other people so that it propagates across the community? And what kinds of scaffolding could support this spreading process? Well, to answer that question, it helps to know a little bit about cultural transmission. And that's why I prepared in the homework assignment a little activity about prestige bias, which is that one way that ideas spread across the population is that if there is a person who is really good at something that other people want to learn, so it's a highly valuable skill, that people will copy the behaviors of this highly prestigious person because they want to be like them. And often the person who has these highly valued behaviors is someone that is exceptional, someone that you want to be like because not very many people are like them. And here you can see one of the greatest basketball players in history was Michael Jordan. And for years afterwards, people would dress their children in the clothing of Michael Jordan in the hopes that their children would become like him. And there was even a Gatorade commercial in 1991 called I Want to Be Like Mike, which specifically said, imitate Michael Jordan, drink Gatorade, where they manipulated this tendency of people to imitate a famous person. They used a celebrity endorsement to get you to buy Gatorade. The lesson here for us, if there is a regenerative practitioner who's really good at something, that's someone we can highlight and showcase to help spread their skill. So it might be that someone is really good at creating compost or biochar, or really knows about the native plants and how to collect native seeds and creates a native seed bank. Whatever that practice is that's highly valuable for regenerative efforts, we can employ this prestige bias by trying to elevate the visibility of this person so that they can be a teacher of others so others can learn from them. So you see how this bias can be manipulated for marketing, but we could also strategically use it as a kind of scaffolding to find the people who are exceptional at regenerative practices in our territory, in other words, regenerative leaders, and make them more visible so more people can imitate them. Another kind of cultural transmission that's quite common is called conformity bias, which just means that when you enter a strange place, it's actually usually a good idea to imitate what most people do. So if you go into a strange environment, what most people do probably works in that place. And so you could try just imitating it. And this is captured in that phrase, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. The important thing here is if we can normalize it, if we can make it feel like more people actually want to do reforestation. So for example, when we arrived in Barichara, we just kept meeting people who wanted to reforest and save the native tropical dry forest. But there was no visible way. It wasn't like tourists arrive here and there's an information center that says, Barichara, the place where they want to reforest the tropical dry forest. It's completely invisible. But if we make it visible that it's actually true, most people here do want to reforest the native tropical dry forest, then others who come here, or those who are already here, will be more likely to come into the reforestation camp, so to speak. And so this is just a recognition that we can engage in strategic communication and storytelling, as well as community organizing, to help the norm be regenerative in content, rather than the norm being tourism and extraction, as it is currently in Barichara. And we can do this without lying. All we do is bring together those people who want to reforest and make them more visible, because they are here. And then this conformity bias will help spread the social norm of reforestation. So you see, that's another way of thinking of a strategy for spreading regenerative practice. But here's the challenge. These processes tend to focus on behavior change of individuals. So yeah, if I have a person and I want them to care about reforestation, if I can show them that more people in the community care about reforestation, they might be more likely to do it. But there are really severe limits to trying to change behavior for individuals because of all of the developmental entrenchment we talked about in the previous webinar about cultural scaffolding, which is someone might want to change but have a really hard time changing, or they might change and find that it's difficult to maintain and then slide right back to their old behaviors. And so there's really big weakness in trying to change the behavior of individuals. And actually, there's a huge amount of social psychology research showing behavior change is maintained at the level of peer groups and social networks. So what we want to see is, how can groups create this cultural scaffolding better than individuals can? And that's what we started to do when we created the Barichara Regeneration Fund, and we raised money with crowdfunding. And then we started to organize regenerative leaders. And this is the basic strategy. We identified areas of strategic focus for recharging aquifers and for reforestation efforts. How did we do this? We met regenerative leaders, we visited their projects, we gathered their knowledge, and we shared it back to them. So I might meet one person doing reforestation work over here, another person doing agroforestry work over there. And as I talk to one person, I tell them what I'm learning about the other person. And what this enabled us to do is to set up frameworks for cooperative management, meaning we bring these people together around a larger agenda using these strategic areas and saying, well, we can't really achieve these larger goals unless we cooperate. And that means we start to work with local landowners and with community associations to coordinate the existing projects. And what we're trying to do is create a group that manages and coordinates these efforts. And then we can organize the way that individual projects work into a network with a network level goal, which is the scale of the entire territory. And we focus on big things like systemic resilience, which can't be achieved at the individual project scale, but could be achieved, for example, in a biological corridor or in a tributary of a river system, where there might be 5 projects sitting within it. So this way of cooperatively regenerating land is what we set out to do. And the way we did this is when we created the Barichara Regeneration Fund, we used part of the money to buy the Ori Hindalagua land for a nature reserve. And then we set aside 30 million pesos, which is about 8,000 US dollars, for community projects. Why did we do this? Because when I put that 30 million pesos on the table and reached out to regenerative leaders and said, would you join an advisory council to figure out how to spend this money in service to the community? Then the people gathered into this pro-social group. And they had money to spend, and they wanted to be sure that it was spent very strategically. So the themes that we came up for gathering them and that they clarified for themselves were water security, reforestation, biodiversity, food security, maintaining local knowledge, and things like this. And I told them, we're creating a foundation called Sueños del Bosque, or Dreams of the Forest, and this advisory council is creating the processes for us to receive money from the outside, but for local people to decide how to spend it, and outsiders have no say in how it's spent. And then we would organize this fund around ecological connections like tributaries, aquifers, and corridors. And this attracted a particular mindset of people who all shared the same identity and purpose of bioregional regeneration for Barichara. So you see, the advisory council itself is cultural scaffolding, and the Barichara Regeneration Fund and the money made available is part of the scaffolding. And the thematic focus and the narrative of the territory is cultural scaffolding, and the mapping of strategic areas and mapping of existing projects is part of the cultural scaffolding. And the existence of a nonprofit foundation, which is actually still being formed and doesn't quite exist yet, will become part of the cultural scaffolding. Meaning all these things will support people to join regenerative projects and engage in bioregional scale design. The vision we created was to activate actions during this year over the theme of territorial regeneration with that 30 million pesos. And we wanted to organize a network of projects using the functions of landscapes. So our timeline is this. In March, we created the advisory council. We raised the funds in December and January. So in March, we created the council. Between March and June, we got really clear about who the council was. We went through a long pro-social process. We selected the priorities and criteria for funds to be given out. And we defined the process for distributing funds. The advisory council voted on the use of funds, allocated it to different areas of projects, and then created a specific focus for community projects. And then about 2 weeks ago, we invited community proposals. We've now received all of them at the beginning of this week. And in the next week, we will select them. And in early August, we'll give the money to create all of these actions. So what this means is the advisory council gathered, created its mission and agenda, defined how it goes about its work, used the money on the table to create community projects, invited proposals from the community to bring people who are not on the advisory council into the process. And you see how we're scaffolding out among people who care about regeneration of the territory. And we're about to disperse funds to between 6 and 8 community projects using the money that we have. So these are the criteria for the fund. So any project that receives funding will have to be in harmony with these criteria. The first is that we can use the projects to map out the territory for ecological and cultural connectivity, or as we see the project getting funding from us, we put it on the map. We'd use this to promote the creation of biocultural corridors of reforestation, which is cultural practices of cooperation aligned with the biological and ecological connections of the landscape. Our key focus, because of the nature of this territory and desertification, is we want to increase water security and restore health to aquifer systems. We do this by protecting and regrowing the native tropical dry forest so that it doesn't go extinct, and so it helps with water security. We organize our efforts around the functions and structures, those connections of landscapes, and we minimize bureaucracy as much as we can and work to the greatest extent possible directly with rural campesino families. So you see, this gives us a lot of what the set of values, the purpose, the alignment, how to invite proposals is made clear in a list like this. So this set of criteria is also part of our cultural scaffolding. And then we have a larger vision, which tells us what we're scaffolding toward, which is the Barichara Regeneration Fund is a bioregional investment platform. It gathers financial resources from the outside world and from the territory, and we invest in regenerative projects. About 80% goes to land acquisitions to protect land and set up nature reserves, and 20% goes to all of these other community projects. In this way, we build a network of projects so they're no longer isolated and fragmented from each other. So we see this as a portfolio of forest reserves and community projects that are organized around the ecological corridors throughout the landscape. And a key principle for us in this territory is to connect with water where water moves across the territory. And we have a larger goal of creating this ecosystem of learning that becomes the Barichara Ecoversity, which is our bioregional learning center that doesn't exist yet. And this would be a place that hosts demonstration projects, offers educational programs, and so on. And it's also connected to the Earth Regenerators platform and the globally focused Design Institute for Regenerating Earth that I created before Earth Regenerators. So you see there's these different scales of engagement from a local advisory council to a network of projects across the territory to a focused ecosystem of learning that is connected to other bioregions through larger scale cooperation. Visually, it looks like this. We have an advisory council. The advisory council is made up of regenerative leaders, people who care about reforestation of the territory. These people each represent their own existing projects. They have a lot of knowledge and practical skill, a lot of experience in the territory, and a lot of connections to other people, which means all of these other people who are reforesting or would like to are connected to members of the advisory council. And by running this process of community grants and other activities, we create a web. We weave a social fabric of regenerative practitioners, building the scaffolding outward across the territory from this focus of the theme of territorial regeneration. So by forming a pro-social group with the purpose of regenerating the territory, we create the capacity for integration of individual projects. And when we create a map like this one, where I drew on Google Earth, I drew the lines for where all the tributaries are for the Barichara River, we can organize them into territorial structures like this river system. So the design process looks like this. We start mapping the regenerative projects. Then we organize the leaders. We help them through a pro-social process to identify as a group, their collective regenerative purpose for the territory. And then they weave social networks of like-minded people to build out a territorial or bioregional capacity. And notice that we can use the cultural transmission insights If we're in a rapidly changing environment, we need to use prestige bias, which is don't just do what everyone here does. We need people to do something different. So that means we need to elevate the exemplars of innovation, the people who are doing really fantastic regenerative work, demonstrate their work, show it to others, train them as teachers and mentors so they can teach others, and then replicate what they're doing in other projects and other places across the territory. But there's also part of this place that has a stable, old, traditional culture. And for that part of our work, we want to showcase the traditional ways, like the campesino way of life, the agroecology of their traditional ways of growing and maintaining food, bioconstruction that is done here historically. Everyone does passive house design here and has for hundreds of years. We want to build pride in this local identity, which means we go and visit longstanding examples and say, this person's grandmother has been making this yucca soup for 50 years this way, and you could do it too. And we want to help these people to resist the pull of globalism that will undermine and destroy the local culture. Now notice we can engage in both of these at the same time. We can elevate the exemplars of innovation to change practices, and we can celebrate the aspects of traditional culture that are already regenerative to help create stability and cultural identity. And between the two, find really powerful interactions. So I just wanted to name that to say that the take-home message here is that we cultivate pro-social groups around territorial goals. We build the scaffolding for the spread of regenerative practices, and then we test out the ways to achieve cultural transmission, all the while noticing the environmental context of change, which means we have to experiment with different kinds of cultural change because we don't actually know what's going to work. And there's this research laboratory, this playground, this sandbox of experimentation that enables us to do this because we're being pro-social together. So that's how we do it at the bioregional scale. That's what we're doing here in Barichara, which can be generalized for any place. But I just want to note that this goes back to our original opening slide. This is a fractal process. What works within the bioregion can be done again between bioregions to build networks for larger geographic areas like entire river systems like the Amazon, or entire continents like South America, or like the entire planet. And also, we can create these pro-social groups for regenerative design of bioregions on Earth regenerators to deploy into bioregions or build connectivity between bioregions. And we'll be doing largely the same process of mapping out the regenerative potential, organizing the leaders, taking them through a pro-social process to find their regenerative purpose, and then weaving networks of people and projects to achieve larger scale goals. So the process is the same regardless of the scale. So that's it. Let's talk about this. Pretty exciting stuff, isn't it? I've got to get back here. It lets me close my, there we go. Hello, everyone. How are we? Are you all hearing me okay? I haven't seen any new activity in the comment thread. Can you guys hear me? Oh, good. It's like, was I just talking to my screen the whole time and no one heard it? So I'm curious, maybe just in the chat box, what kinds of emotions are you having as you're seeing this? What's coming up for you? And then if anyone has questions, go ahead and pop in some questions into the Ask a Question box right here, and we can start to discuss it. The important thing I really want to highlight here is all of this is pro-social, cultural scaffolding, and understanding how social change works. And then together with that is regenerative design, permaculture, landscape restoration, and these other practices that we might consider to normally apply to the non-human or more than human world, which will never get anywhere if we don't build these human processes of cooperation. And what I'm wanting to show today is that we're actually doing this in Barichara right now, even though it's early days. And so far it's working. And we'll learn and we'll share our mistakes and our failures as we go. But what I'd really love for us to do in this learning journey and in Earth Regenerators for the entire community is for us to practice these things and share our knowledge with each other and really get good at doing this. So I realize this is a lot to take in. And so it's okay if we don't need to have a lot of discussion now, because we have 3 community Zoom calls tomorrow and Monday. We can definitely talk about it more. And what I think is so important here is that all of this is about forming effective teams. So, so this is really important. And one thing that's already coming up is I'm seeing 2 questions being asked, one by Kathy and one by Bob. I'm going to actually invite Kathy onto the screen. Kathy, if your technology lets you do it, because Kathy's here in Barichara, and I'd love for her to share her experience of what's happening here. And she asked the question, wondering about the barriers between outsiders and foreigners and the local Barichara residents. Why are there not more people volunteering in the bioparking? And that's because Kathy and I go up there every day, and it's just the 2 of us foreigners that are doing it. And I hope it works for Kathy to join me, because I would love for her to be able to share some of her experiences here. Kathy, are you able to get on? Are you having some troubles? It looks like it's trying to let you on, but it's not working. If it doesn't work, just drop a message in the chat box and let me know what's going on. What I'll start to say is that, oh, I guess Kathy's here. Hello.
Hi.
Howdy. For everyone who doesn't know, Kathy is like 2 houses over from me, just right here on the same street. So we're neighbors. Would you like to share, Kathy, from your experience, you've been here now for about a week and a half, just what it's like here being part of, like I just talked about this, but what's it like to be here? And then we can talk about your question.
Sure. Well, of course, being and feeling like very much of an outsider, not knowing the culture, not knowing the people, I can observe the fact that people are very friendly towards you, Joe, and everybody greets you with a big smile, and a genuine warmth. So, and I know that you've been building these relationships over the past couple of years here, year and a half, whatever it is. And yet, you've got the advisory council, but not the volunteers who are, out there wanting to take on the work in the bioparque or the vivero, or actually, replanting natives and so on. So that's where my question comes from.
Yeah, Kathy and I've already talked about this a bit, so I may review some territory that you're already seeing. One thing is that Colombia has a specific history of long-term, widespread violence, of basically terrorism enacted upon it by its own people for 57 years, and which recently came to an end, and in some ways hasn't ended, because the police just murdered 30 or 40 innocent protesters in the last couple of months. So there's some of it that's still going on. Not here, but in other parts of Colombia. And so one thing that happens is people sort of keep their heads down. They learn that if they become too visible in their communities, someone might come along and kill them. And so there's an actual hesitancy and an inability to be trusting and open that is part of Colombian culture. Another thing is that a lot of people here are so dependent on the tourism economy that they stay in their shops and sell things for the tourists and then just don't have time to do volunteer work. And the third thing that happens, I think, is that a lot of people are not really aware of what we're doing yet, and we don't have enough to demonstrate to them what we're doing. And we're just getting to the point now, I think, where we can show our friends. Like the other day, 2 friends dropped by when Kathy and I were pulling grass in the Food Forest Project, and I took about 10 minutes and just walked them around and showed them what we were doing, and they were really impressed and wanted to come back and do more. But if I'd shown this to them 2 months ago, they probably wouldn't have really seen what we were doing. It wasn't developed enough to see it. And so another part of this is that it's the demonstration capacity for the work I'm doing is not far enough along for me to have that credibility. I sort of have to demonstrate it for a while and walk the walk for a while for myself. And I think it's some combination of these. And also the absence of economic opportunity, which is if we had a way for people to have their economic needs taken care of while they're doing the work and getting trained and probably getting certified so that they could have employable work later doing regenerative design, that would really help them. And so I think there's this other piece is some specific economic models of support or scaffolding that doesn't exist yet, where we're talking about running a permaculture school using some of the fund that we have, and people going through that school would get trained for free, but also we could certify them in permaculture, which means they could then work on other projects. So some of that scaffolding is also missing, and it's just too early. And those are just like highlights of some of the elements, I think. But I'm curious if you would add anything to that, just from what you're seeing so far, that you're seeing.
Well, I guess just that when we talk about pro-social and forming these networks, it doesn't necessarily mean that people would be out doing the same work that you're doing, that in the bioparque, but that there might be other manifestations of this sort of thing, such as that people might decide, well, why don't we start harvesting our rainwater as a community? Or why don't we start dealing with our sewage as a community? Any of those would be wonderful for the landscape, wonderful for the well-being of the people, and yet we don't see those things happening either.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, which I would summarize an element of it, which is that people don't need to be volunteering with me to be part of regeneration of the territory, which is actually an essential insight, because we don't need to all be doing the same thing. And that's a huge deal. And there's more that you were saying there, but I want to make time for the huge number of questions that came in now. And so I'll talk to Kathy later. We'll go up to the bioparque after this in a couple hours and pull some more grass and do some more work. Thank you for the great question, and thank you for being here, Kathy. It's lovely to get to hang out. I'm going to jump over to the next questions because a bunch of them have come in while we were chatting. And let me just see which one's got the most votes. There's one there with 6 votes. Yes, this is a question from George. So I'll invite George onto the screen. And George is saying, any ideas on creating those linking roles that are core to developing the network? There are many projects and community members in our area that are a bit too busy with their own projects to communicate and coordinate in the way you are sharing. George, this is actually something that I noticed when we lived in Costa Rica, because when we were in Costa Rica, we visited a lot of permaculture projects. And what we tended to see was there's so much work in managing a single project just to keep them going and make them excellent, that there's no bandwidth left to go to a larger scale. And this is a really important insight. And I don't know if the tech's going to let you on. I've invited you onto the screen, but it doesn't seem to be working for some reason. So hopefully you're able to join me, but I'll keep going just so we use the time well. I would say that this is a modular integration. And what I mean by that is we do not replace the emphasis on those local projects. What we do is augment them by creating a different focus that's modular. There are people who have the role of creating this network integration that are not the same as the people running those local projects, or at least at a group level, the group is not the same as a local project. And this means we have to build the specific capacity, and this is something that a bioregional learning center could do. Or like we're doing, have a foundation that does it, have some community organization that does it. And I think this is a really critical thing, is to recognize that each individual project is going to need to flourish and do really well. But similarly, we need to augment it with this higher level integration, and that's its own work. That's a different project. And that's just a piece that I've seen missing everywhere I've ever gone, which is why I think this is so important to learn. And sorry, the tech didn't work for you to join me on the screen. I don't know what happened there, but it's a really good question. And let me jump down here. There's another question here by, I don't know why it didn't work. Sorry, we couldn't talk about it. Claire has a question, and for some reason it won't give me the option of her to join the screen, but I'll go ahead and start answering it. So Claire, if you're there, you can drop a message in the chat box. Claire asks, how do you develop transparent accountability, feedback loops that can reflect difficult questions or messy stuff that the main spokespeople aren't raising? One way I would say this is if you remember from Eleanor Ostrom and those 8 core design principles, one of them is monitoring of helpful and unhelpful behavior. And one thing that we do as part of this work is mapping. There are lots of different kinds of mapping that we do. And so as we're mapping out this process and mapping out the projects and then receiving proposals for community projects to receive funding, transparency arises simply by us seeing what's going on and talking to each other. And most of it's dialogue, most of it's conversation. But it is a monitoring process, and it's simply recognizing how important that is to do. So I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but I want to just keep it brief because so many questions are coming in and I haven't gotten a chance to talk to anyone else yet. Let's see, I see Alpha's got a question here, and maybe Alpha can join me. Don't know why the tech didn't work for George or for Claire, but Alpha, if you're there, I've just invited you onto the screen. And he's asking, what's the best way to approach local government to involve in the collaborative process? Ooh, I've got a really disappointing answer to this question. Can the local government cover some of the cost of restoration? And no, it wasn't covered, but I'll say Latin America is so famous for its local corruption that the local government is effectively an informal mafia here and does everything it can to do things like money laundering of narco-trafficking money and other things, and actively obstructs regenerative work. So we have challenges that are not at all unique to Colombia when we think of Latin America, but mean this question has this very interesting double edge, which is how do we create effective local government when it's so corrupt? And then how do we stop local government from attacking and destroying our projects when they're definitely not going to help us? So it's a really, really messy situation. But I'm talking and I want to hear from you, and you've arrived. So
Okay.
jump on in. And it's great to see you. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it's good to see you. So we've actually been weaving all of a sudden in the last 3 weeks this whole network of watershed water eco restoration in different areas. So this is really good because I'm trying to figure out how we get all the different parties to strategically work together. And in Owens Valley is one of the water projects, which is in California, where LA drew all the water away from it. So we have some land there, and we're trying to figure out how to restore the water there. And so my friend said, look in the local government. And so they actually have stuff in the general plan for the government there in California that actually has to do with eco restoration. And so anyway, so there might be possibilities of working with the local government on the project here in California.
Yeah, I would say we have a specific situation typical of a lot of Latin America. And my general experience in the US was the closer the government gets to the ground, so your city government and your city councils and these things are where the best work can be done. And also conservation authorities like there's the Metropolitan Transit Authority of the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, or the Met Office for Portland, Oregon, which is a regional transit network. Or I remember in Oregon specifically, where I have more experience, there were rivers where watershed management associations, community organizations were set up, and they partnered a lot with local government. And to great effect, meaning doing really good work. So I think this is a huge area of opportunity in general. Just here in Barichara, we've got a particular situation.
I want to share also like something I just discovered this week too. There's something called the social impact bond. So the government may find it too risky to fund water restoration, but if you say you can raise aquifers by 2 feet or something, they can put up a bounty in the social impact bond, say $100,000. And investors may, invest $10,000 to dig swales or something, knowing that they might get this $100,000 if the groundwater rises.
Yeah, what I really like about that idea is it's the same mechanism we're using for our fund, which is you put a pool of money on the table and say, anyone who wants to achieve the goals of this money can participate in the use of this money. And that's just like a general mechanism, right? So for a municipality to do that with green bonds or social impact bonds, and there are some other mechanisms like transfer of development rights, where one group is paid not to develop farmland into housing, and then that money goes to densification of another part, which is there's a pool of money made available. there are lots of mechanisms for this, which I think are super important. So I think that's a really good example that you're bringing up. Anything else you want to throw in and jump onto this before I jump into this?
My other question, but like we actually could explore NFTs too. So like, so we could raise money by NFTs, and you get different perks if it rises, and then maybe you could put the bounty for the government or drought insurance companies on the NFT itself. So if the drought, if we actually manage to bring back rain, which sounds risky, but then the drought insurance company may put down $10 million or something.
Can you just briefly explain what an NFT is for people who don't know?
So it's this thing in cryptocurrency. So it's a non-fungible. It stands for non-fungible token. So the idea is that so it's being used a lot for artworks right now. So instead of selling the physical painting, you're actually selling the digital rights to the painting. And so artists are making money selling the NFTs, but it hasn't been explored so much as a kind of usage, almost like a bond or almost like a fundraising device. But there is a group, Future Thinkers, that just use an NFT to raise money for the Eco Village. So anyway,
Mike and Yuvi did that. They did a great job.
So now we're kind of exploring. So we're starting all these, or some of them are in progress. Like, how do we raise money for a lot of these world eco restoration projects? Maybe we could do an NFT fund. And anyway, I would like to connect with some of the Earth Regenerator people to see if they might want to maybe partner in doing this NFT.
Well, Alpha, if you don't know, a Seeds Explorers group was just created on Earth Regenerators, but it's currently a secret group, meaning it's unlisted. And that's just because they're figuring out what it is. And they just started it this week.
I think I joined it.
Okay, but if you haven't, you definitely should.
Okay, yeah. The feed seems really good. All the cool people seem to be on it. So
yeah. Well, it's lovely to see you. Since last time I saw you was in San Jose in Costa Rica. It's been 2 years, so it's nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Yeah, and great to have you here, just mingling in these common spaces. Alpha and I've known each other for a while. For everyone who doesn't know, it's been about 10 years we've known each other. Great to see you, and I'm going to jump on to the next question, but let's keep this rolling in the discussions. So thanks a lot, Alpha. Beautiful stuff, and let's jump down here. The next question we have on the roster, sort of hitting a bunch of them quick, a couple of them with 3 votes, so I'll just pick one. Marcus has a question here. Marcus is saying, how important is land acquisition? I'm in a region with high demographic pressure, resulting in a skyrocketing real estate market. As a consequence, all regenerative projects are and remain very small scale. Oh my goodness. Marcus, you would love, I gave a webinar last year saying that basically we can't regenerate anything without decolonizing land and removing it from the private market. And the end game is the entire planet is a commons again. And we just undone the pathology of private land ownership. And so that's my short answer to your question. But I suspect you have more context to add to how we can make this concrete. So tell me more. What are you thinking here?
Yeah, I mean, I follow you entirely, because this is where the blockage is exactly. So we can't move on with land acquisition because it's just too expensive, and we network all these small projects. We have all kinds of networks, and but the overall amount of land that this covers is absolutely ridiculous in relation to private land ownership. And then, of course, we have areas that are state-owned and that are already protected areas, and so it feels like in a straitjacket. So we can't make any further steps somehow. We can't even create a single eco-village in the whole region. It's not possible. We can't afford the land. So I've no idea how to make actual steps, towards this bold vision you're explaining, which I resonate with. But concretely, I mean, that's a revolutionary vision to get rid of private land ownership. But how do you go along with this?
Yeah, one thing that I noticed is the more developmentally entrenched a landscape is, the more difficult it is to do regenerative work until that entrenchment collapses and breaks down. And there's a great example of this is the Common Land Foundation. which William Ferwerda and that group, which just do fantastic work. And one thing they do is they go to really degraded places, like the Altiplano of Spain. You know, a million hectares of land that's been degraded by the Roman Empire and everything since, like 4,000 years of desertification. And so the land, like there are places within that zone where they're trying to give entire abandoned villages away because no one will live in them. Like you can have the village if you'll just come live here. And the lesson there is that economic value measured in the extractive system is often inversely related to the real, like the practical potential to regenerate. The ecological potential is different. The practical potential is like, well, can we actually do it? And it's amazing if you go to the most degraded places, economically, it's more doable for exactly the reason the economy doesn't work there. And so it's very paradoxical. But those are slow processes because they're starting from really deep levels of degradation.
I mean, this relates back to the question I asked earlier in the whole process here, which is about, do we have criteria to select appropriate places to invest our regenerative work in? And so give part of an answer here. So that would mean that in the place I am, you know, basically you can forget about it. Because in the next 50 years, there's little scope to actually come to a reasonable size of regenerative landscape restoration. Whereas in already degraded landscapes, where mostly in rural places where there's low population density, there's much more scope to do this work, right?
Yeah, and one thing that I noticed here in Barichara is this is like the Wild West. Meaning the regulation is really weak, which is why all the rivers are polluted, why there's so much destruction of the environment, but also means there's a lot more you have the freedom to do because you don't have all of the zoning and regulatory pressure, which is often well-intentioned, but pathological when related to regeneration. Meaning you can't get a zoning permit to grow a certain kind of tree in your yard, which would actually be really ecologically beneficial. That sort of problem at larger scales. We learned this deeply when my wife was working for the University of Washington, which has about 80,000 people in it. It's like a small city, basically. And then also when she worked for the city of Eugene in Oregon, the city of 150,000 people, was the entrenchment was so great that didn't matter how good the policy framework looked. Your ability to make impact was effectively nothing, or just be overwhelmed by the general tendencies of where everything was going. And so we started looking how to disengage from that and just went further and further from civilization for these structural reasons. And of course, the nature connection is stronger in this pattern of moving away as well. But it's got some pretty sobering implications, so it definitely warrants further discussion. Because it's, you know, I don't want to make this blanket statement that degraded landscapes are always the best. I don't actually mean to say that. But as a heuristic, you're going to be in the right direction by starting with that. Is probably true. But we need to have more discussion and really get into the weeds of this to figure it out. But it's an awesome topic of discussion, so we should talk about it more. Do you have any other thoughts?
Looking forward. No, I'm looking very much forward to deepening this, because this is really somehow critical. I mean, for probably for many of us, and especially those that are more in urban areas and so on, this is a crucial question, isn't it?
Yeah, and like our ability to just literally walk. There are walking paths. We walk on these stone paths through the territory that the indigenous people walked before the colonizers arrived. So we're in a place where there's ancestral infrastructure, and they didn't pave the roads until the 1980s. And so it's only been about 30 years that fossil fuel infrastructure has been here, because we're in a remote area of the Andes. And it's just a lesson. It's, you know, where fossil fuels can't easily go is a place where post-fossil fuels have a chance during the time of collapse. Afterwards is a different story. But in the next 30 or 50 years, these are very important trade-offs to think about. So thank you for bringing it up. It's really important. Awesome. Thanks, Marcus. These are serious challenges. I do not mean to, I hope that we are recognizing just the severity of these challenges, because they're really a big deal. I see we have a question here from Barry that's getting some good votes on it. Barry, I'll invite you in. He's asking, we're saying, teaching and beginning to use pro-social is not just a day. So how did you hold on to attention and convey the ideas and practices of pro-social? This is super important, Barry, super important, which is to say the pro-social process is a regenerative process, meaning it's a dynamic living system. And so if you're working with oak trees, you work at the speed and scale of oak trees. If you're working with bacteria in a petri dish, you have the speed and scale of bacteria in a petri dish. And so how quickly you do this, how long it takes, really depends on the cultural context you're in and the scale and speed of that culture. One of the great strengths of Barichara is the culture is really slow. Barichara is actually an indigenous word, which means a place of rest. And so people come to Barichara on vacation because it's so relaxing to be here. It's walking pace. You see 90-year-old women sitting on the streets that say hello to you as you walk by on the cobblestone streets, which is why it's this tourist destination and it's beautiful, but it's also a place of slowing down. And as you slow down, the connections get deeper. And this is a really important understanding is here, I'm a year and a half in, and as Kathy said, people still don't join me in the biopark to volunteer. So it's a slow process. And I'm okay with that because I understand I'm doing 20 to 30 years of work here. But I think just recognizing the scale and scope depends on the living system of your own culture that you're working with. And I hope that answers it well enough. I know you didn't make it onto the screen. Not sure if you're even still with us. I also recognize that we're getting to our agreed upon time, but I think these questions are so important. If it's okay, I'd love to just roll through all of them. And see, Alpha had already asked the question about the NFT, so I'll let that one sit for now. Just say, that's a great topic, and I'd love, Alpha, if you would maybe go to the course page for this learning journey, and in the activity feed, you can go to the little plus sign box in the upper right and write a post about NFTs or pose a question. And then also do it in the Seeds Explorers group to just get that conversation going. I think that'd be really nice. And then I see we have a question here from Bob and one from Jonathan. I'll invite Bob onto the screen and then Jonathan. And Bob's asking, what do you believe the Barichara area will be like ecologically in the next 20 years as we go through this process? Well, what I actually think it's going to be like is there's going to be a polarization of patterns, which is, I think there's going to be a lot more destruction and a lot more regeneration, both at the same time. But first, Bob, how you doing? It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
What are you thinking about all of this? And tell me more about your general response to the question.
Yeah, but you know, I don't know how long you plan on being there, but even if it just got things going and was able to self-generate itself for a while, in about 20 years, if you kept the right mindset and everything, you talked about in one of your other podcasts about trying to make sure that the not high desert, but high something dry forest does not go extinct, kind of thing. And you know, how do you see the actual landscape yourself from the desertification that's there now to what might be able to be, you know, the dream of what it would be like ecologically in the next 20 years? So.
Yeah, they're looking at the other examples where people do large-scale ecosystem restoration. Like there's some fantastic examples in the tools and tutorials section of Earth Regenerators. There are a couple of videos of projects in India where they work on large scale with water. And in 3 to 5 years, they transform like 100,000, 200,000 hectares of land. They transform it. They change the climate of those regions in 5 years. And so the way they do that in India, I'll give you the links to the videos. My friend Stefan's coming out of the shower like, where? My antenna are up. And the way they do it is fractal, What I mean by that is they have small scale interventions. They get a huge number of people to each do the small scale intervention. And it's like putting dimples on the landscape. If you build enough dimples on the landscape, you're going to change the entire flow of air and water on it. And they do that. One of these projects was for something like the water supply for 40 villages in India. And they did it in 3 years. And so the lesson here, and my dream for like 20 years out, is if we can get enough coordination around water retention and soil building, that in 5 years we'll change the hydrology, which means we will begin to change the meteorology. But that'll be delayed because the first few years is going to be barren land, getting water in it and some ground cover and building the soils from like clay and rock. So you're not going to have very much vegetation. There's just not enough biomass. But after you get that circulation changing, then between say 3 to 5 years out to about 10 years out, so like on this roughly 1 decade time frame, you can start to change the surface connection of hydrology. As moist air moves over, it doesn't dry as much because you have this evapotranspiration happening. You don't have that dry, hot air drying out the clouds. So in 10 years, you can start to change the meteorology, which means you can create a reforestation process. The forest starts coming back. But it's still not forest yet, it's too early. So by 20 years out,
when do you think
yeah, what's that?
So when do you think the critical mass will be for the 100th monkey to show up, to actually change the mindset of the locals?
Well, the way it's happening now is there are 3 veredas, and veredas are like rural postal districts. Like you'd have your rural routes in the US. Here they're called veredas. There are 3 veredas where a school teacher is working with children, elementary school and middle school children, who are creating their own research laboratories for restoring the water supply of their own tributaries. And they're already doing it. And the way they do it is the families, these are campesino families in the country. These are not foreigners, these are local people. They decide not to sell their land and they protect their water supply. And they're gradually restoring it. So what that means is that if they just kept going, they might get 3 or 4 other veredas. And in this territory of 50,000 hectares I talked about, there are 18 veredas. So how do you get from 3 to a majority of them? Might just be getting another 3 or 4 schools to do this. And then from there, jumping to 8 or 10. And then you got more than half. So my sense is with the most powerful process, this could happen quickly and it could be led by the children. And that's actually what I see is the parents' minds are changed by the children. And that's already happening in those rural places. And so the children become water guardians. They set up their own research because their teacher's helping them do it. They've created their own radio station and YouTube channel. And actually one of the proposals we received was to buy a video camera or a good smartphone or something. The kids could make their own videos because they have a YouTube channel and they want to teach each other permaculture. These are 8-year-olds that are doing this, and 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds. So my sense is that the most powerful way this could happen is through a process like that. Just a groundswell of cultural change led by the people who are most connected to their own water security. And if that started to happen, that 100th monkey could be next year. And it's sort of hard to predict because it depends on how various things converge. But super important question.
Thanks.
Yeah, but thanks a lot, Bob. Looking forward to discussing more in the Zoom calls. And I'm going to jump over. I see we've got more questions came in. Oh no, we're already over time. Oh my gosh, that's all right. Am I being too mindful about how much time we use? I don't know. Let's see here. Jonathan asked a question. I'd love to just catch this question from Jonathan, and then we do a wrap up because we're getting so far over time. Jonathan saying, so interesting and appropriate that the vision comes after identifying the projects in the territory. How might this be different from other teaming approaches, particularly in order of design? I know Jonathan has a lot of experience working from policy frameworks, as an example. where the policy framework might lead to what the shared vision is, or might name the shared vision. So what I would say is the philosophical position here is the philosophical position of embodiment, which is the actual land embodies the organizing principles. And those organizing principles are the connectivity of the land, the biological corridors, the aquifer systems, the tributaries, that those are the connectivity of the land. And if we use those to see where the projects fit into that landscape connectivity, then the vision arises from it. And that is a regenerative design approach. And that is different from other approaches because it starts by organizing from the land. The organizing principle is the landscape's functions, which is, I think, a really key thing that I emphasize a lot in my work. It's not the only way to do this, but it's a powerful way to do this, which is why I find it so helpful and so important to describe. So that's my response to Jonathan's question. And if it's all right with everyone, I'd love to just wrap up because we're pretty far over time. I see some people have already dropped off because they needed to go. And just want to ask, for those of you who are still here, if you could drop in the chat box, just how are you doing? Are you overwhelmed? Are you thinking? Are you excited? Are you looking forward to the Zoom calls? Just give me a feel as a closing. I'd love to see those come in the chat box for those of you who are still here. And then we can close. Oh, Meaty's got like music. I like that, Meaty. That's beautiful. And Gail's connected with Alpha. Oh my God, Gail, you and Alpha are going to get along great. He once gifted me a book on open collaboration with, oh my God, he just knows a lot of cool stuff. Alpha is a gem of knowledge. Lovely to have him here. So yeah, I see a little overwhelmed and inspired, says Justin. Shimon is saying he's feeling solid and looking forward to our group call. Looking forward to Zoom, says Pamela. Lots more questions to be discussed. Yes, Marcus, let's rock that out. Extraordinary, yeah. I'm just loving it. Thank you all for these beautiful, beautiful comments. Yeah, so many parallels between these types of projects, George, because bioregional design is general, but it's ecologically contextual, so it's unique in its expression each place. But we can approach the beginning process very similarly. So thank you everyone for being here today. This is a super important topic. Let's learn and practice how to do this and then teach a bunch of other people how to do it because we got to get this happening all over the planet. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to the Zoom calls tomorrow at 6 p.m. Central, Monday at 11:30 a.m. Central, and 3 p.m. Central. Come to as many of those as you would like. And by the way, Jonathan and Victoria just posted a beautiful blog article that they posted on Earth Regenerators that I encourage everyone to go have a look at about ecological restoration, regeneration, sustainability. Lots of good stuff bubbling up all around. Thank you all for being here, and onward, fellow humans.